welcome to a new Getting to Know Japan webinar. Thank you for joining us, and a big thank you to our sponsor, the Japan Foundation New York, for funding this series and enabling us to put this on each week. Today, we are joined by Dr. Tomohiko Taniguchi, who will be presenting on former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's legacy. Dr. Taniguchi worked as a primary foreign policy speechwriter for the late Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. He collaborated with Mr. Abe in drafting the speech, Confluence of the Two Seas, which the late Prime Minister delivered to the Indian Parliament in August 2007. Whether in an official capacity or private capacity, he worked with Mr. Abe for a total of 15 years. His latest book, the Prime Minister Abe's Speeches in Japanese, reflects on how Mr. Abe utilized speech occasions to advance the nation's agendas, including Abenomics, Quad, and the FOIP concept. Dr. Taniguchi has held the position of specially appointed professor at the University of Tsukuba since April 1st, 2003. Prior to that, he was a professor at Keio University while working alongside Mr. Abe and his close aides at the Prime Minister's residence. Dr. Taniguchi, it is a pleasure to have you with us today, and I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. It's a great occasion for me to commemorate his achievements and remember who he was. Japan is fighting two long games. The first is repelling China's territorial advances, and the second is addressing the country's declining birth rate and aging population. These challenges are intertwined. If Japan's external environment remains unstable, long-term domestic investment will not grow. Furthermore, more people will be disinclined to have children in a country where long-term investments are seen as risky. The key is to reverse this negative spiral and create a positive, self-perpetuating loop, which is precisely what Prime Minister Abe strove to do. This endeavor demands the 3 C's: commitment, consistency, and continuity. Abe Shinzo infused these C principles into Japanese politics, economy, and diplomacy from December 26, 2012 until September 16, 2020. Abe's commitment was clear in his relentless work ethic. He often spent his weekends either on international business trips or visiting regions devastated by the March 2011 tsunami. He was a tireless leader. It's fair to characterize his efforts as those of a man keen on fully utilizing the health granted to him. Born in 1954, Abe Shinzo developed ulcerative colitis at 16. The disease hit its peak when he served as prime minister from 2006 to 2007. One noteworthy point is that during his worst health period, he received the loudest applause and standing ovation of his life. This came after he delivered a speech to the Indian Parliament titled, as was introduced, Confluence of the Two Seas. It was likely the moment he recognized the profound impact of his words. He later assumed office once again and gave equally inspiring speeches to the Australian and US parliaments, inching closer to the establishment of Quad. After he resigned from his post in September 2007, Japan saw a rapid turnover of prime ministers, with 5 leaders: Fukuda, Aso, Hatoyama, Kan, and Noda, in just 5 years before Abe reassumed office in December 2012. Abe carried a significant burden of guilt, believing that his premature resignation directly contributed to the period of instability in Japanese politics. Then a serendipitous event took place. Following the acquisition of a specialized Swiss pharmaceutical firm by the Japanese drug manufacturer Zeria, a specific medicine became available in Japan. Abe began using it, and his health dramatically improved. At the age of 56, Abe finally, and for the first time in his adult life, succeeded to manage the chronic illness. This health revival granted Abe a sense of physical confidence that many experienced far earlier in life. In this respect, Abe was quite literally reborn. He adopted an ethos of let's do it again. And if we are doing it, let's tackle all the difficult challenges. This resolute spirit attracted around 20 individuals, myself included, all of whom were eager to pledge their unwavering support to Abe. Since the 1990s, the office of the Japanese Prime Minister had undergone a lengthy reform process and had been granted a robust mandate. Its capacity had expanded, yet without a strong, cohesive force filling this vessel, leadership would not surface. The Abe administration was the first to accomplish this. Now, today, corporate Japan is led by individuals who know nothing but the country's waning fortunes. In the early 1990s, a speculative bubble in the stock market burst, triggering a subsequent collapse in property prices. Over the 2 decades since then, the emerging generation has lost hope for the future. Unable to envision their future amid the rising numbers of the elderly, they feel alienated from their own prospective life paths. Prime Minister Abe has identified this chronic issue within Japan. He observed a self-reinforcing causal loop spiraling downward. The question was how to reverse this trend and encourage positive momentum. How could this downward spiral be transformed into an upward ascent? Here are the steps he implemented. Early in his second term, he announced his intention to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP. This caused agricultural interest groups, which had previously resisted, to cease their opposition to Abe, resulting in a surrender of their political influence. Abe significantly shifted the support base of the Liberal Democratic Party, or LDP, from rural to urban areas, rejuvenating the traditional party. To bolster labor input, he promoted workforce participation among women and the elderly. To facilitate this, he improved both child care and elderly care services. It's accurate to say that not a single day passed without Abe stressing the significance of womenomics, a concept he learned from Kathy Matsui. He also often cited Ariana Huffington, saying that if Lehman Brothers had been Lehman Brothers and sisters, it might have remained prosperous. To incentivize positive investment and foster reform in risk-averse companies, he restructured corporate governance system, ensuring that pressure from institutional investors was effectively applied. Furthermore, he attempted to persuade Japanese companies to inject cash into the economy, for example, by drastically reducing corporate taxes. To his disappointment, though, this move was met with steadfast resistance from the corporate sector. The so-called third arrow of Abenomics, aimed to stimulate private investment, proved unsuccessful. Until recently, when prices started to rise, Japanese companies were reluctant to release their vast cash reserves and deposits, which totaled 60% of the nation's GDP. The problem lay in the excessive caution of Japanese corporations. Besides labor input and capital investment, another, the only remaining avenue for growth, is through enhancing productivity. The Abe administration seriously addressed the issue of improving total factor productivity as a policy objective, the first such attempt ever pursued by any Japanese administration. Alongside the TPP, the administration also enacted the EU-Japan Economic Partnership, the most significant free and democratic interregional agreement. These partnerships, TPP and EU-Japan EPA, are expected to expose Japan's economy and industry to intense international competition, fostering greater efficiency and productivity within the domestic economy. As inferred from the above, Abe Shinzo endeavored to redefine the Japanese identity. Consider a 2-by-2 diagram where the horizontal axis or x-axis represents the value placed on alliances with maritime democracies, and the vertical axis, y-axis, represents the degree of respect for tradition. Abe positioned himself in the top right quadrant of the diagram, where he honored tradition while actively seeking partnerships with maritime democracies. Similar to how Britain has its little Englandism, Japan has its little Japanism. Yet, Abe didn't choose this path. The free and open Indo-Pacific concept, developed in collaboration with India and Australia, was as much a symbol of Japan's identity politics as it was a geopolitical and geoeconomic notion. Abe championed a free, open, rule of law, liberal international order at a time when globalism was generally retreating. For those who remember Japan in the 1980s, this might seem hard to believe, but it's true. Former Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull has repeatedly asserted that without Abe, the TPP would not have been achievable. In this manner, Abe played a pivotal role in revitalizing the Japanese economy. And yet, the advent of the COVID-19 pandemic delivered a severe blow to economies worldwide, including Japan's. Nevertheless, Abe's belief that Japan's security was contingent upon economic growth, coupled with his continuous encouragement of the younger generation, emphasizing that economic development must be infused with hope and a clear vision for the future, proved to be eminently logical. Abe's foreign and security policies hinge on the expectation that Japan will return to being a robust economy. This is a self-evident truth. Japan's national budget surpasses Turkey's or Saudi Arabia's GDP. Look at it closer, though. Around 70% of this budget is earmarked for specific purposes, such as bond redemptions and interest payments, grants to local governments, and most rapidly and increasingly, social welfare, especially the elderly care. Presently, the Kishida administration continues Abe's policy of expanding the defense budget. Still, without economic growth, there are limits to any budget expansion. For instance, the budget allocated to Japan's Coast Guard, which manages the world's sixth or the eighth largest exclusive economic zone, is smaller, actually, than that of the Tokyo Fire Department. Be that as it may, external threats are not standing idle, waiting for Japan to get stronger. Today, Japan's external environment is arguably the most precarious since the advent of its written history. Russia, North Korea, and China directly aligned themselves against Japan. Among these, Russia and China possess veto powers in the UN Security Council, which makes the UN's ability to safeguard security highly questionable, especially in areas close to Japan. All three nations, Russia, North Korea, China, have never experienced democracy and are oblivious to the concept of freedom. All are developing nuclear weapons and continue to enhance their delivery methods. Imagine if China were to launch a military assault on Taiwan. It's quite plausible that North Korea and Russia would seize the opportunity to militarily provoke Japan and the US-Japan alliance. In the face of this extremely dangerous environment, Abe Shinzo undertook three key initiatives. Firstly, he strengthened the US-Japan alliance. Despite substantial political capital expended, Abe made it possible for the US forces and Japan's forces to collectively combat threats. He amended the law concerning the self-defense forces, allowing Japan to regularly protect US ships and aircraft. This arrangement has now extended to cover Australia and even the UK. Secondly, he championed the launch of Quad. Narendra Modi, Scott Morrison, and notably Donald Trump and then Biden, mainly due to Abe's influence, enthusiastically supported the establishment of Quad. Military exchanges between Japan and India expanded dramatically, both in terms of quality and quantity. Whether Indian troops would be summoned in a crisis in Taiwan remains uncertain, as is the extent of potential Australian military involvement. That is fine. It's crucial to continually demonstrate that Japan has allies. The contrast with between Japan and China becomes starkly apparent. China lacks partners and allies, whereas Japan boasts a robust US Japan alliance alongside the ever stronger partnership it has with Australia and India. Recently, the UK also signed the Hiroshima Accord, hinting at a revival of the historic Anglo Japanese alliance. In this manner, Japan is currently projecting a powerful signal to China, thereby elevating the political costs of any adventurous maneuvers toward Taiwan. The first two initiatives were the US Japan alliance and Quad. The third attempt, unfortunately, was unsuccessful. 27 rounds of direct negotiations with Vladimir Putin. If we can't do it now, when can we? That sentiment echoed between Putin and Abe every time they met as they endeavored to resolve the dispute over the Northern Territories and establish a peace treaty for the first time. Abe's sole objective was to conclude a peace treaty between Japan and Russia in hopes of diminishing or at least making the northern military threat slightly more predictable. This strategy was entirely founded on geopolitical considerations. Nevertheless, these efforts bore no fruit. If Prime Minister Abe were alive today, he would unequivocally advocate for the implementation of severe sanctions against Russia. In a global context, what were Abe's contributions? First, he portrayed the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean as an interconnected and indivisible expanse that must be free and open. When Abe returned to office for his second term, no counter ideas or counter concepts existed in the democratic world against China's One Belt, One Road initiative. The FOIP, Free and Open Indo-Pacific, strategy that Abe proposed then brought to light the opportunities provided by the vast open seas surrounding the Eurasian continent. In this regard, Abe underscored the importance of infrastructure, particularly quality infrastructure, or QI, that does not enslave any nation in debt, a stark contrast to the infrastructure erected by China and for China's largely own sake. The concept of QI swiftly gained global traction. Second, he persistently engaged the United States despite its withdrawal from the role of global police through two radically different administrations, Obama's and Trump's, ensuring its involvement in the Indo Pacific. For an extended period, Japan has been a recipient of security provisions in its relationship with the US. Nonetheless, Japan houses the largest American military asset outside the US, making the US's Indo Pacific concept impossible without Japan. This places Japan as a key influencer in the US's global strategy. Recognizing this, Abe conceived the idea that Japan and the US should collectively strive to bring transparency and security to the global order. Post Abe, the US, now under Biden's administration, adopted the FOIP and Quad concept, crediting much of it to Abe, marking an unprecedented instance of a Japanese prime minister's ideas shaping US strategy. Third, he invested boldly in India, a significant democratic power. The long term strategic, political, and economic ties between India and Japan are arguably the most crucial in the great grand game against China. Abe Shinzo's popularity in India remains immense, reflecting his profound commitment to India's future. This coming Saturday marks exactly 1 year since Abe's tragic death. The assassin who took Abe's life was positioned 13.11 meters behind him, separated by a road filled with traffic. This distance, a mere 70% of the span between a baseball mound and home plate, was reduced even further as the assassin crept closer. Had any of Abe's entourage glanced back, realized the threat, and warned him, the fatal bullet would not have been fired, and Abe would still be here, alive and well. The crime that took Abe's life was entirely preventable, which brings not sadness, but lingering anger to my heart. With this, I would like to conclude my speech and open the floor for questions and answers. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Taniguchi. And once again, I want to extend my condolences to you and to everyone who worked with Prime Minister Abe and got the opportunity to know him, because in just listening to everything that you were saying, speaking about his legacy, it's very clear that you meant a lot to him, or he meant a lot to you rather. And I'm sure the same could be said vice versa. But in any case, thank you so much for joining us today. And I would like to start the questions, if I may. As someone who worked with Prime Minister Abe and knew him as a politician and as a person, what do you hope he is remembered for?
I think I have already addressed some of those questions in my speech. He succeeded in expanding Japan's diplomatic horizon to a great extent, and he encouraged Japanese younger generations to work harder to achieve more prosperity. I sometimes called him an accidental cheerleader in chief, in addition to uh, commander in chief. Cheerleader in chief was the role he chose to play almost every day. And but there are some things that he could not have achieved. He could not achieve. One of which was to amend the ninth article of the Constitution so that finally members of the services would be able to gain honor they deserve from the nation. So there are some things that he could not achieve, but overall, he would be remembered as someone that was probably the most transformative, certainly in the history of Japan's post war period. But judging from his longevity and the strides that he has made in bringing Japan ever closer to the world's center stage, he might be the single most transformative politician, political leader. Some might certainly argue in the future.
Thank you so much. So you mentioned that he was unable to change the Article 9 of the Constitution. So that leads me to my next question. In terms of the Prime Minister's legacy and perhaps some of the things that he wasn't able to do, in what ways do you think the LDP has carried on Prime Minister Abe's legacy well? And in what ways have they failed?
It's too early to say anything substantial. Firstly, some of the plans to develop Japanese defense capabilities have been carried on by the current administration of Kishida's. The administration issued 3 documents December last year, all of which were well crafted and to the point. The question remains, however, whether or not the government could carry out the plans and implement the plans as were stated by those documents. Basically, the achievements that the current administration has shown so far have been good on the defense, security, and diplomacy fronts, and yet the administration has not succeeded in mobilizing people's consent domestically. That's a normal pattern, if you like. An administration grows stronger each and every time it carries the general elections. Kishida is yet to be tested for that matter. Whether Kishida could carry out and win the general elections probably this year would be a very much important test. And only by securing more and even more political capital, an administration could tackle bolder issues, including the amendment of the Constitution. Kishida has mentioned a number of times that he wishes to change the Constitution over the next year or two, but whether or not he could walk the talk, quote unquote, remains an open-ended question.
Thank you so much. So we have a question from Vivian Ying. Asks, if a legacy is what a person is remembered for, what does the average Japanese person remember about Abe?
There is a degree of differences between age groups, those who have grown while he was in office, those who have spent their formative years, their school ages. Um, Japanese prime minister automatically means one single individual of Shinzo Abe or Abe Shinzo. There was a threshold uh, between age groups below 45 and above. Above 45, and the older you get, you had more uh, powerful, staunch oppositions and Abe haters. Baby boomers are the core members of the generation that did not actually like Shinzo Abe. And the reason why they did not like Shinzo Abe, Abe Shinzo, was that he was very much interested, Abe was very much interested in changing the safe haven uh, in which most of the baby boomers believed they were in, thinking about nothing related to Japan's defense and security. And those were the havens created perhaps by the stable, ironically, environment of the Cold War era when Japan was under near total protection of nuclear umbrella of the United States. And those days are long gone, but I would say there are some people in Japan who have so far failed to catch up with the reality, and those were the people who hated Shinzo Abe, Abe Shinzo.
Thank you. So David Bowling asks, um, it seemed like Prime Minister Abe and Prime Minister Kishida were a rival of sorts. What would you think Prime Minister Abe would think of Prime Minister Kishida's term as Prime Minister so far? What would he like and what would he dislike? Do you?
If Japan were a mega carrier of oil, uh, it's a huge, if it were a huge vessel, it seems it is navigating on autopilot. Whoever is in the deck behind the wheel, this ship continues to go on as planned. But the sense of directionlessness, the sense of directionlessness is prevailing, and the nation is devoid of strong voice that many people wait to hear from the leader. The nation is struggling with two long games, as mentioned, as I mentioned in my speech. Challenge from China and how to tackle demographic time bomb. Let's take an example of the second factor of tackling demographic challenges. This country is probably engaged in one of the most difficult tasks for any democratically elected government, namely to reduce the entitlement that the government had long promised to the elderly and to increase the commitment to be given to the younger generations, especially childbearing generations. Well, it's called changing social contract. And that is easy to say, but difficult to do. In order for the government to carry out one such difficult issue, the leader must come out and say a number of times why this is important, how they can do it, and how much support they wish to have from the voters. Um, those kinds of explanations, personal commitment of Kishida's, are yet to be seen. And I think that's something that not only politicians such as Abe, but also many people in Japan are eager uh, to see sooner rather than later.
Thank you so much. So John Mensing asks, were there, or um, if so, what are some of the tensions, or what were some of the tensions between Prime Minister Abe and Prime Minister Kishida, um, both personally and in terms of their factions and supporters?
I don't know. Um, Kishida was rather unassertive, not assertive, unassertive member of Prime Minister Abe's cabinet. Under Prime Minister Abe, Mr. Kishida spent quite some time as foreign minister. At that time, Japan's foreign policy was handled almost entirely from the top, from the prime minister's office. And Prime Minister Kishida, at the time, Foreign Minister Kishida, was a reliable executioner, someone who could implement Abe's policies. But one thing that I remember is what Abe told Kishida on a very much casual occasion over dinner among the members of the entourage of Mr. Abe's on a tour in a foreign country. Kishida-san, Mr. Kishida, barely changes at all, however much alcoholic content he digests. He's a hard drinker. And Abe, half jokingly, told Kishida, Kishida-san, you should better change a little bit. You don't change at all how much amount of alcohol you took. So implying that Kishida would be more likable, if you like, if he changes a little bit. Which explains who Kishida is, because he's stable, calm, probably loses temper only occasionally, but strength, guts, assertion, those strong words sound a little bit unfit to describing who Kishida is like.
Thank you so much. In addition to this kind of talk around the relationship or the tensions between Prime Minister Abe and Prime Minister Kishida, there were also some questions about going back to Prime Minister Abe's legacy. So Vivian Ning asked, what are the transformation that Abe has enacted that should go down in history, in the history textbooks?
Japan was at a crossroads in many respects. Its economy continued to go downward. The nation was just about to lose hope for the future. And the nation was just about to give up any possibility to push back uh, coercive diplomatic challenges daily observed coming from China. And the United States was retreating, it seemed, from the world's center stage. Then came the second administration of Shinzo Abe's, and he did all those things that I mentioned in the speech that I gave. So the future generations, I hope, will look back at what Shinzo Abe did and point to his period as a crucial period that Japan stopped sliding away. Japan stopped losing relevance, and Japan started to regain its kinetic, kindred spirit. And certainly, given the difficulties in tackling two long games, one between China and Japan and one between generations, it was Abe who paved the way in order for the country to continue to face up to those challenges. Those are the things that I think future generations would remember with.
Thank you. Natija Bonho said Abe-san facilitated a delicate diplomatic balancing act at a time of immense environmental pressures. What might those who did not have the ability to work with him fail to understand about his legacy?
Can I ask you to repeat the question part again?
Yes, of course. What might those who did not have the ability to work with Prime Minister Abe fail to understand about his legacy?
It's a curious question. If there are many people who could not remember anything about the Prime Minister's legacy, it would mean that Prime Minister Abe has left no legacy at all. I don't think it'll be the case. Take, for example, some of the amendments that he introduced into Japanese security provision. Those would clearly be remembered as a foundation for future Japanese security policies. And when it comes to Quad, FOIP, and so on and so forth, that's those broad geographic, geopolitical, geoeconomic concepts. I think many people would certainly remember that those were the things that Shinzo Abe worked hard for, and those are still things that matter. So I don't think I could answer differently.
Thank you so much. Tom Whitston asked, how do you evaluate Abe's contribution to improving the Japan and the Republic of Korea relations? Is Kishida's progress solely due to the nature of the current Republic of Korea's leader?
I think the questioner has given an answer by describing the second part. It was nearly impossible for Japan to do anything with the Moon Jae-in government. Moon Jae-in administration described Japan as if Japan were its enemy number one. And Moon administration changed some of the agreements that should have been otherwise rock solid. President Yoon has taken some bold steps to improve South Korea-Japan relationship, which is crucially important given the environment. But I'm not so much optimistic. I'm cautious, neither pessimistic, because of the brutal South Korean politics. President Yoon has to win massively over the general elections due next year. And given the short period of fixed presidential term of 5 years, the lame duck period for any Korean president comes very soon. So we will see. There have been many turnarounds and in Korea-Japan relationship. I don't want to see a deja vu anymore.
Thank you so much. So Linus DeValdez said that during Prime Minister Abe's administration, he faced some of the largest public protests in Japan's modern history during 2018 and 2019. How do you see them in the overall context? Was Prime Minister Abe impacted by these demonstrations?
Prime Minister Abe was a decisive and determined politician, so much so that he, in some respects, was a polarizer. Baby boomer generation, those beyond 70 years of age, were staunchly opposed to Abe's changing Japanese defense posture at all cost. And strikingly, many of those people hit the road and gathered around Prime Minister's residence almost every day, but particularly on Fridays. And I was every day going back and forth between my home and the Prime Minister's office. So I had to elbow through a massive number of people. So I witnessed that there were so many elderly men and women in the crowd. The same went with Japan's nuclear power policy. Abe Shinzo wanted to reactivate some of the nuclear reactors that were proven safe, but he could not achieve much. And I'm not sure what is the reason behind the silence, behind the quietness that now surrounds the Prime Minister's office. Although Prime Minister Kishida has been quite brave, let's say, in pushing this agenda of reactivating Japanese nuclear power plants. Not many people gather around Prime Minister's office. Maybe those people were probably sick of going around the same issue and going to the Prime Minister's office. I'm not sure, but it's true that the 2008, 2016, 2015 and 16, when Prime Minister Abe tried very much hard to change Japanese security and peace and security laws, Prime Minister's office was surrounded almost every day by a huge number of people. And yet, after several years since the passage of those legislative agendas, thereby strengthening Japanese defense capabilities, enabling Japan and the United States to collectively work in times of real crisis, very few people continue to protest. So they were not actually committed, one could argue, in agendas as much as in their personal feelings towards Abe.
Very interesting. Thank you so much. Mr. John Bradford asks, could you comment a little bit on how the creation of the National Security Council and the Personnel Office strengthened the power of the Prime Minister's office? This seems useful in that it made policy changes easier. However, if the Prime Minister office can make change easier, then does this mean policies might not be as strong, as they would have less consensus-based support from the Diet, bureaucracy, and voting population?
Among the achievements that Shinzo Abe made, the establishment of the National Security Secretariat and National Security Council should remain among the most important, because there was only a fragmented structure, no cohesive center, aside Prime Minister's office, prior to the establishment of the National Security Council and National Security Secretariat. Some people said prior to the establishment, given the turf battle and silo culture that Japan had, well, there would be no cohesiveness, even if they put together members of the foreign ministry, members of the defense, and members of the national police, and so on. It's proven thus far incorrect. There have been 3 heads of National Security Secretariat, and all of them have proven very much effective. Objectively speaking, it is the head of the National Security Secretariat, whose name is Mr. Akiba, is the one that has met Prime Minister Kishida much, much more times than any others. So you can see from that figure that Akiba has been very much effective in trying to help shape Prime Minister Kishida's, and by extension Japan's, security policy and defense and diplomatic policies.
Thank you so much, Dr. Taniguchi, for answering all of our questions today. There are so many more other questions in the chat, but thank you very much for your time today and for your presentation. It was very powerful. And of course, taking time out of your evening to be with us. And once again, thank you to our program sponsor, the Japan Foundation New York. And lastly, I would like to present some upcoming events.
Well, I wish I could address all those remaining questions. Thank you very much, nonetheless, for having me so far.
Our pleasure. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Okay, Jeff, could you please present? Okay, so our next.
Bye-bye now.
Thank you, Dr. Taniguchi.
Bye-bye.
Our next Japan security policy our next Getting to Know Japan webinar is going to be next Tuesday, Tuesday, July 11th. It's on Japan security policy transformation, why now? And Dr. Corey Wallace will be speaking with us about that topic. On Thursday, July 13th, we will have a book talk. It's called Imperfect Partners, the United States and Southeast Asia. Former Ambassador Scott Marcel will be the speaker for this book talk. This will also be on Zoom. So if you have time next Thursday at 9 a.m., please join us for this book talk as well on Zoom. We also have 2 community conversation events coming up. So on July 18th, on Tuesday, it will be on Japan's Pacific Island countries' cooperation on maritime law enforcement. This will be in Yokosuka. And Dr. Yurika Ishii will be the speaker for this event. The event will begin at 17:30 with refreshments, and the seminar itself will start at 18:15. So this will be an in-person event in Yokosuka for community conversation. And the last community conversation event will be on Wednesday, July 19th. It will be on India and the Quad, the weakest link or a necessary pivot, I'm sorry. It will begin at 1800 with refreshments and 1830 with the seminar itself. Speaker Yogesh Joshi from the National University of Singapore will be the speaker for this event. This is an in-person event in Fusa. So if you have time, on Tuesday or Wednesday to join community conversations in Yokosuka and Fusa, please join us for that as well. And I will post the links in the chat momentarily. But while I'm doing that, I want to say once again, thank you everyone for joining us. We hope that you enjoyed tonight's conversation. As always, thank you so much for the really great questions and joining us each week. I hope to see everyone next week for the next Getting to Know Japan webinar. And also, like I said, if you have time, please join us for the book talk and also for community conversations in Pusa and Yokosuka. Thank you once again for joining us tonight. We hope you have a great night and we hope to see you next week. Thank you. Bye.